All right. Well, hello, everyone. So welcome to class number 2 of the Science, Prophecy, in the Bible class. Really glad to notice we got quite a few logged on. I'm pleased we didn't scare anybody off last week, but we've actually added a few more this week that have requested some access. So I think, if everyone looked on that was signed up, we'd have pretty close to 70 people. So we're really doing good. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Just a very good class, and this is probably one of my favorite science parts class this week, just because we go into a lot of detail of various things that I think are really applicable to today. But I think we just get right into it. We've got a number of slides to look at, so why don't I go ahead and do that. So this week we're going to be looking at kind of a comparison between creationism and evolution. So it's a pretty stark difference, so it's pretty easy to see the differences. And the first part, we're going to just look at creationism, and which is basically just why we look at the Bible as a young earth. And then we're going to contrast that with evolution and what scientists say in their opinion about the earth. So as I mentioned last week, I really like to kind of show the main points of the class and then show all the details. And at the end, we'll look at, what are those points again. But one of the main points of this class is going to be in Genesis 5. If you recall, it'll show the age of the patriarchs. There's about 22 guys, starting from Adam and going all the way to Jacob. And it reveals their age and when they died and when they had sons and all that. And that's where the young earth comes from. Of course, we know that God created the whole universe in 6 days, but at what point did He do that in the past? And this set of scripture, which we'll look at, details that pretty well. And then we're also going to look at how evolutionary theory breaks the fundamental laws of physics. We briefly mentioned that last time, but that second law of thermodynamics that says that things will tend towards disorder. And naturally without any other energy input. This evolutionary theory totally breaks that. So we'll be looking at that. And also much of the evil in the world comes from the belief in evolution. And that might be a little surprising because people don't typically think about evolution on a day-to-day basis unless you just work in that field or something. But you'll see how it's tainted a lot of ideas that have come into our society in the United States as well as the world. So we'll be looking at that. And then also the kind of the final point is that it really takes faith to believe in evolution the same as it does creationism. And that's a big point because a lot of these things that scientists try to say is fact are not facts at all. That there's a lot of faith in their assumptions, that they think that things are old and they think that the same processes that are going on today, the same rate that they're happening at it happened the same, millions of years ago. And that's a very big faith assumption. And matter of fact, I think it's a whole lot more faith to believe in evolution than it does creationism. Okay, so this is this Genesis 1, verses 1 through 31. Sometimes it's called the time block of creation. And I think it warrants just reading through that since this is on creation. So let's just, if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis 1, and then we'll just read through those verses there. And it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God said that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." And of course, that first day would be Sunday. And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. And God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit and with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. And the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seeds in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, and it was the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning on the fourth day. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing that was with the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, and livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground. Everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw that all he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and morning, and it was the sixth day. So it's interesting that really his only two commands at the very beginning of creation was to go forth and be fruitful and multiply, and to just take care of the garden. That really was kind of the only deal. He did mention that the plants were for food and not the animals at this point, because no death had occurred at this point. But it's interesting that in the beginning there was very little rules to have to live by, and it wasn't until sin came in the world that there was much more sinfulness. And of course that he told them not to eat of the tree of life, but like I said, just very few rules that they had to deal with in the beginning. But as we read, you can see these first, second through sixth day and seventh day, he all said good at the end of each day, except for the sixth day when he said it was very good. And some people might say, well, that's because that was the end of his creation, and so he's just saying everything was very good at this point. But I also recognize that he created man on that sixth day, and that's the only creation he had that was in his image. So I tend to think that the very good comes in because he created mankind that was in the image of God. It's also interesting, Tuesday, you notice that's the only day that there's actually two things that occur. The land and seas are gathered, and the plant life was created. The Jews actually believe that that's what's known as Tuesday is known as a double blessing day. So it's kind of interesting that every Tuesday is a double blessing because of God creating two things on that day. So did God really create the day in 6 literal days? Some folks would say that, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years are like a day, like it's in some place in scripture. Um, but really every time this word yom is used, that word day that's being used here is the Hebrew word yom. And every time it ever has an adjective in front of it, or numerical adjective like that, it's always a 24-hour period, and in every single case in the Bible. So there's no reason to believe that it would be different here. So it's almost like God's making very sure we understand. He says evening and morning, and then there was first through sixth day, and then using that word yom in there for 24-hour period. So it's like he's making very clear these are regular days and not some version of colloquialism or something like that, where we can say it took me a few days and it really was 4 or 5 days. But no, this is specifically a 24-hour period. And like I mentioned, that the Tuesday is known as the double blessing day for 2 blessings that God gave on that day. In Exodus 20, this is written by Moses, and this is about the 10 commandments. And he says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreign residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. So therefore the Lord blessed the 7th day, or the Sabbath day, and made it holy. So why did God make his creation in 7 days or 6 days? Did he really need to rest? And of course, he didn't really need to rest on the 7th day. He's God, but he made this 6-day creation and a rest on the 7th as a pattern for mankind. And just to put something in the back of your mind, and once we get to the prophecy section, we'll do this in a lot more detail. But in Hosea, the book of Hosea, it talks about God speaking through similitudes. Similitude is just a model or a type. So, for example, like the whole sacrificial system that the Jews had of sacrificing lambs for sin of man, that was a similitude for what Jesus would do in the future with his sacrifice on the cross. And so we can see that there's a lot of similitudes that occur even in the Old Testament and even some in the New Testament for things that are going to happen in the end times. And you can gain a lot of insight by looking at it that way. And so we're going to be looking at some of those similitudes that focus on the end times as we get into that section. So just keep that word similitude in the back of your mind. And we looked a little bit at this last week about Jesus. What did he think about the literal 6-day creation? And of course, he said, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, and from the foundation of the world, and since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel. And he even said that, but do not think I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom your hopes are set. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? So Jesus is confirming and making clear that what Moses wrote was true. And of course, Moses wrote the 10 Commandments, or at least through God wrote the 10 Commandments, and that's talking about the 6 days so you work as the pattern that God had for his work day or work week. So it's definitely something that Jesus believed in, was a 6-day creation. And of course, creationism is the belief that the universe was created by the God of the Bible. We can read in Genesis 1:1. We just read that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then in John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was with God in the beginning. And through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And then a little further down in verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So it's telling us right there that when it's talking about the Word, that's talking about Jesus. He was the one that became flesh. He's the part of God that became flesh. And so it's talking about in the verses up above we just read that all things were made through the Word. And so who was the creator? And that was Jesus. A lot of people hadn't really thought about that. They just assume it was God the Father, but Jesus is actually the creator of the universe. So as we get into more specific here, how do we know? We hear sometimes the age of creation is 6,000 years or thereabouts. So where do we get that from in the Bible? And we're going to be looking at that here in detail. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 5. And this is one of those sections of Scripture it's kind of tempting just to skip over it when we get to it. If you're having a quiet time or Bible study and you're reading through Genesis and you see this long paragraph that just has people, so and so begat so and lived this long and all that, but there's a lot of things that that you can glean from that. And so we're gonna look at that Genesis 5 section here, and it says in verse 1, "This is the written account of Adam's line. And when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them man. And when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness and in his own image, and he named him Seth. And after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. And after he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. And after he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Enosh lived 905 years, and then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. And after he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Kenan lived 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. And after he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived 895 years, and then he died. And when Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. And after he had become the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived 962 years, and then he died. And when Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. And after he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived 969 years, and then he died. And when Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah. And he said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toils of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." And after Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. And altogether, Lamech lived 777 years, and then he died. And after Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So you can see that long genealogy there gives us a running total. And there's other verses that give some other details, some other insights into ages of patriarchs. You can research there and look at the chapter 11 and 16 and 21 and 25. But the kind of the key point to helping us solve the puzzle here is that we need a calendar time that can be relative to the biblical events. And what's interesting when we read 1 Kings 6:1, it says that Solomon began the construction of the temple 480 years after the Exodus. And so we know from archaeological evidence that the construction of the first temple started at around 967 BC. There's fluctuates a little bit a year there. But so we have a time relative to this time frame that we're talking about of 967 BC. And then another thing is we need to know when the persecution of Jacob began. And this is kind of a key thing. If we turn over to Genesis 15, and verse 13. This is where Abraham fell into a deep sleep. And the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years." So God is kind of prophesying to Abraham that your descendants are going to be mistreated for 400 years. So then if we turn a little bit further over to chapter 21 and verse 8 and 9, this is where Abraham had basically two wives: Hagar, the wife that was basically a slave, but then he also had Sarah. And so he had the first child with Hagar, and it says, as far as Isaac was born, and it says the child grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham was mocking. And so it's kind of considered that this is kind of the first, kind of the beginning of the persecution, because it's kind of hard to imagine, but it says that Isaac was a young child. He was just now weaned from his mother, and probably it's a little subject to what that means, weaned, but at the very most he'd been maybe 5 years old. Well, Esau was 14 years older than him, so you have basically a 19-year-old that's persecuting a 5-year-old, and that seems a little childish, but nonetheless that's exactly what was going on. So if you use that as your beginning of persecution, that's the beginning of Abraham's descendants starting to be persecuted by Ishmael. Like I said Esau a while ago, but I meant Ishmael. And of course we know that the nation would be persecuted for 400 years. So if we take all that information and we can kind of put together some interesting tabular data. And so if you look at this slide and just ignore the right side for a second, and let me just describe this table. So the first column is just the patriarchs from Adam to Jacob, and there's 22 of them, 1 through 22. And then the second column is the year of their birth, so that's the number of years after creation. And so Adam started at the very, very beginning, a year 0, and then Jacob was born 2,108 years after creation. And then there's the third column talks about the age at the birth of their son, and then the age at death, and then the year of death, and that's from the creation point. And then the last column is the BC date. And notice that encircled is the 3900 BC. So that's basically the year that the earth was created. Now, we'll say a number of people in history past have done this, and I mean everybody from Johannes Kepler and Sir Isaac Newton, and the most famous one is a guy named James Ussher. He was an archbishop in the Scotland Church. I think he lived in the 1600s, and that's usually the one that's used. But I kind of took it upon myself to do it my own way, and I got a little bit different. It was pretty close to what the other guys had, but a little bit different. But some interesting things you can glean when you look at this. Scripture says, I think it's in Genesis 7, that when Noah was 600 years old is when the flood came. And we can see from the tabulated year of birth that Methuselah was 369 years older than Noah. So if you know that Noah was 600 when that happened, then add the 369 and you get 969, and that confirms that the year that Methuselah died was 969 years after creation. And then that corresponds to 2244 BC once you do all the math there. But it's very interesting, the name Methuselah. He was the son of Enoch, and of course Enoch was raptured or translated away at a young age, or young for them anyway, and so obviously he had a very close relationship with God, and and knew a lot of prophetical things. And the name Methuselah means his death shall bring. And so apparently he knew that when Methuselah died, this catastrophic flood, or maybe he didn't know it was a flood, but he knew something was coming when his son Methuselah was going to die. And it's interesting too that Methuselah is the oldest person to ever live. So it's really a picture of God's grace. God is holding back, sending his judgment on the earth for as long as he can. He knows that he's going to send this judgment when Methuselah dies, and he lets Methuselah live the longest of anybody, 969 years. So it's very telling of God's grace through that long age of Methuselah. So those are just some insights there. So once you tabulate those time frames, the year of birth, if you tabulate that up, you start to see that you can get down to when the first temple was built, and we knew that was 967 BC in our time frame. But using these years of the birth of these patriarchs, you can see that corresponds to 2933 years after creation. And of course, we know there's 480 years back from the first temple to the Exodus, so that gets us to 2453. And then, of course, the 400 plus 5 years because of the weaning time, maybe 5 years old. That gets us to when Isaac was born. So that kind of gives at least a good cut at when and how old the earth actually is. And that Exodus from Egypt corresponds to 1447 BC. And that's an interesting date there, and we'll look at that here in just a second. But as I said before, in any time you're doing prophecy studies, and it's always important when years are involved that it seems like it's always a Babylonian year, a 360-day year. And of course, we have to get into our calendar. You have to determine what the true years are, because a true year is not 360, it's 365.2422. So once you do that conversion factor from creation to the temple, it's actually 2,891 years. And then from the temple being created to year zero, that's 967 years, as archaeological evidence proved. And then from that point till today's 2021, so that gets us 5,879 years since creation. And the Jews keep their calendar year, and they say that year 2021 and on our timetable is really 5781 by theirs. And of course they have their own means of judging since creation, but I'm not exactly right on it, but there's about 100 years difference or so. There's various reasons for why it's different, but it's in the ballpark. Certainly not thousands of years off or different. So it shows that the creation has been around for about 6,000 years. I guess I would say that I wouldn't necessarily be hard over on 6,000 years. There's some prophetical reasons why it is 6,000 that we'll be looking at later. But some people think, well, these were really just the patriarchs were. There was other generations, other families in between these patriarchs. They weren't in linear succession like that, and so maybe it's 12,000 and not 6,000. And I might could go with that if there ever found evidence for that. But I would just have to say that even if it is 12,000 or different than 6,000, it's certainly not billions, and certainly not evolutionary time frames, even close. So that's really kind of the main point of that. And you can kind of make an interesting little plot when you take those ages of the patriarchs into consideration. The x-axis that you see there, the horizontal axis, is the number of patriarchs from 1 to 22, starting with Adam. And then the y-axis, vertical axis, is just the age at death of each of the patriarchs. And of course, you can see Adam there at 930, and it's going along pretty evenly in the 900 range. And then, of course, Enoch is translated at 365. So it's a big dip there. But then it jumps right back up to Methuselah, the oldest guy ever, 969 years. And then Lamech at 777, I believe it was, and then Noah at 950. And then it's real interesting that Noah, the people right after the flood, just started dying off very quickly, comparatively. You go from Noah, who lived 950, and then after the flood, it zooms down the next guys, in the 600 range. And then it kind of levels out in the 400 range, but then that's when the Tower of Babel occurred. We see that with Peleg, because it says that, in the earth was divided in those days, talking about the people dividing because of their languages being confused. And then people just started dying off quite quickly after that, until we see Jacob, who lived 147 years. And that dashed red line, that designates in 2020, the oldest living person that I found was a Chinese lady, but she was 100, or still is 117 years old, and so she still got 30 years to catch up to Jacob. But it shows that we're still not really close to what a lot of these patriarchs lived. I'm not sure I really want to live 900 years, but at least in these days and times. But nonetheless, that's kind of a comparison there with the ages. And this is a really neat world history chart. You can go to this website at amazingtimeline.com, and I know it's really hard to see on just this little slide, but I have a chart. Actually, I was going to show it to you. Let me see if I can see if you can see in the background. So if you can see behind me here, I've got the same chart on my wall here in my office, and it's basically around a 5.5 by 5.5 foot chart, laminated, and you can read it a whole lot better, but even then it's still very dense with information. And if you're really want to study some biblical historical things, that's a really good chart to have. Basically, it starts at the as a clock. If you start at the 12 o'clock hour, that's the beginning of creation, and all these yellow lines are showing the patriarchs time frame. The very first one is Adam for 930 years, and then Shem, and on it goes. And it'll kind of show you, what happened in the rest of the world, like over here on the left side. Columbus discovers America in 1492, and what was going on in the Jewish community during that time. And of course, all the way over almost to the 930 or so hour is our current day. So it's just kind of an interesting little chart, world history chart from biblical perspective, that you can get, and you can, I think, download the PDF like I did here, but you can also buy the actual poster of it. And one of the very interesting things is this integrated message in the names of these first 10 patriarchs. There's so much there. It's almost like God really rewards when you really search deep. Jesus used to say, he who has ears, let him hear. He's almost like he's saying, pay attention, I'm saying something important. And it's, certainly in the case of here, because if you just skimmed over this section of scripture, then you might miss a lot of the things. But if you look at the actual meaning of the names here in this list of patriarchs, we can see that Adam, his name means man. Seth, he means appointed or granted. And Enosh, he means mortal or sick or despaired. Kenan means dwelling or chamber. Mahalalel means the praise of God. Jared, it means to descend or coming down. Enoch means initiated or disciplined or to teach. Methuselah, that's the one we mentioned earlier, that his death shall bring. Lamech is despairing or destroyer. And Noah means to rest or to comfort. So when you take all those meanings, and you maybe a little bit of subjective work there, but if you put them all together, you can see that there's actually a summary of the gospel there in Genesis 5. And you put it all together, man was appointed mortal sorrow, but from his dwelling place the praise of God shall come down teaching, and his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort. So pretty neat little prophecy there, all of the very early ages of the Bible. Now, there is a theory that some people hold to called the gap theory, and it's kind of a form of the old earth creationism. You know, people that wanted to believe the Bible, but at the same time, they thought the science was, conflicting with the Bible. But it basically says that creation as described in Genesis involves a 24-hour, 6-day literal creation, but the gap of time between two distinct creation is that you can see in the first and second verses of Genesis. It became popular near the end of the 18th century, just as the newly established science of geology. This is where they were, looking at rocks and trying to theorize how old these rocks were, and they just thought the rocks were so much older. How could Genesis be correct? And it's even discussed in that 1917 Schofield Reference Bible. So, and it allowed these Christian geologists to try and reconcile their faith with science. And where they get this is in Genesis 1 and the first 2 verses. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form. And instead of using the word was, they substituted and used the word became. And so it makes it sound like there was a first earth, and the first earth maybe had all the dinosaurs and whatnots in it. And then it became form, and the second earth appeared, and that's when Adam appeared. And so all the dinosaurs and all that were destroyed in the making of the second earth. But that does not really jive once you analyze what these words actually mean in the original Hebrew. That word was, this hayatha, is normally translated was and not became. And there's other verses in Scripture that uses the same Hebrew word. In Genesis 29, we see that Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored, and that same word was is the same Hebrew word there. And according to most scholars, there's no difference in the construction between Rachel was beautiful and then the earth was without form. And so there's no need to suggest there's some kind of rare meaning of the word was to be became on the grounds of the context. So again, it's really a dangerous and slippery slope, because people believing science above God's word, and that's really a shame, because it sends you down a really bad path, as they were trying to do here. And one last thing about the creationism, a lot of secular folks say, well, there's no such person as Moses in history. There's no record of him. And but if you really think about it, these Egyptians, when Moses came and a lot of bad stuff happened, the 10 plagues, and then all the slaves that they had left Egypt and basically plundered Egypt with all their gold and silver. And then when they had second thoughts and tried to go and destroy them, they all drowned in the Red Sea. So it was not a very pleasant and happy memory. So you can imagine a Pharaoh's not wanting history to even remember who Moses or the Hebrews were. So there's a whole lot of erasure, I think, that occurred, or certainly just not documenting what happened. But we talked about this verse before in 1 Kings 6:1, that Exodus took place 480 years before the construction of the temple. And of course, that meant that the Exodus took place in 1447 BC. So if the Exodus took place in 1447 BC, then that's about the time frame Moses would have been around. When Moses spoke to Pharaoh when he was 80 years old, he spent his life can be basically divided up into thirds. He spent the first 40 years in the palace of the Pharaoh, and of course then he had the episode where he killed one of the Egyptians, and he fled to the backside of the desert and stayed there for 40 years. And then that's when God called him and went back to Egypt when he was 80 to ask Pharaoh to let his people go. So if you look at that, it looks like that 1527 BC is when Moses would have been born. So we look at some of the, just down through history, what the who the rulers were of Egypt during Moses' time frame. Of course, we know Moses, he was in a basket in the water, and the Pharaoh's daughter found him, and they brought him in and basically adopted him into their house. And one of the interesting things is this Thutmose the First. He reigned from 1540 to 1504 BC, right in the time frame of when Moses would have been born. And you notice that his name is Thutmose, and his wife's name is Amos, and his first name, her firstborn son, was Amenmose. And so you can kind of almost see this this almost surname of Mose that they would name an adopted child Moses. And it's a lot of subjection there, but it's still it looks like that could plausibly be. And then we look at Moses fled when he was 40 years old, and so that would have been 1487 BC, and so that would have been during the reign of Thutmose II, and he reigned 1492 to 1479 BC. And then, of course, he approached Pharaoh again when he came back when he was 80 years old. And that time frame is this Thutmose III, when he would have come back. And it's interesting that Thutmose III, there's documentation that says that his firstborn son died. It doesn't say how he died, but it does say that his firstborn died. And so, and of course, the last plague to force the Egyptians to let the people, Egyptian or Hebrew people, go, was the killing of the firstborn son if you didn't have the blood of the lamb smattered all across your front door. So so firstborn sons would have died, and Pharaoh's son as well. And so it does give some credence to that there was a real Moses. All right, so that kind of wraps up just the creation part and where we get the young earth ages in creation. So let's look at what is evolution. So evolution is just the change over time in one or more inherited traits found in populations of individuals. And of course, Charles Darwin made this very famous, lived in, you can see there, in the 1800s. And he's kind of considered to be the father of modern evolutionary theory. And of course, he was the father, but it became very well adopted amongst science and in every area of study. And it's been really claimed far beyond what Darwin even claimed that it would do. So he probably would be shocked to see that it's been used as far as it has been. And of course, he's famous for going to the Galapagos Islands. And this was a series of islands out in the Pacific, out in the middle of nowhere, really. And he wanted to observe these animals and creatures on this island because they were, in particular, these birds, these finches, that had different characteristics. The islands were far enough apart that they couldn't travel to either one. They had to stay on their own island, but they were the same bird, but yet they had two different beaks. The one island had a bird, the finch, with a big, thick beak, and then the other island had the same finch, but it had a very small, slender beak. And he observed what they ate, and the ones with the slender beak ate basically bugs and small little insects, and the ones with the big beak on the other island had they were eating nuts and things that were harder and needed a bigger beak to break through to get their food. And so he surmised just from that little bit of change in the same bird that this was an evolutionary process, that due to the environment, this evolution of the bird was happening, and he could see that. And of course, that absolutely does happen. You could call that microevolution, and sometimes it's called adaptation, and or just variation. And I have no problem with that. You can look at dogs, for example. You can have a Great Dane that's weighs 200 pounds, bigger than a lot of people are, and then you can have like a teacup Yorkie that you can put in the palm of your hand, and they're still dogs. There's no evolution going on. It's just that there's just variation within the species. So that's micro evolution, and I think that definitely does happen. That's just God's way of allowing us to adapt, animals as well as humans, to adapt to other, our surroundings. But the one thing that is not happening today, but scientists insist it is this macro evolution. And this is change above the species level. So that's like a fish to amphibian or a primate to man. It's very, just disingenuous really to show, just like that picture I have there that shows a primate evolving into a man. Like I said, the last class, really, if they wanted to really be truthful, then they would show it's a fish to a man. And even further back than that, because that's where the ancestry would have come from. So it just makes it's really kind of ludicrous to have that kind of thought that we came from that way, just from the complexity of it, as you're about to see as we go through some of these charts. So there's kind of two primary theories of evolution. Before we get right into that, you would think evolution, why would it have stopped? We look around our creation today. Why don't we see something that's, one species and currently evolving into another species? Why don't we see something that's currently going like that? And we don't. And that's where they come up with this other evolutionary theory called punctuated equilibrium. The classic Darwinianism evolution, that's just the gradual change over millions of years into another species, the slow transition, fish to mammal and ape to man, that kind of stuff. But because they recognize that they can't find any transition fossils in the fossil record, and they can't see any transitional species right now in the current record. So they came up with this punctuated equilibrium. And so you don't need long periods anymore. You can have just very short, rapid evolutionary development. Sometimes the scientists themselves, call it a hopeful monster theory. And this would be like, a reptile laying an egg and a feathered bird hatches out, that kind of thing. Whereas just in a matter of just a few generations, a new species has come about. But of course, that's never been proven and never been seen, and never will, because it's not true. But they're desperate to try to show something to do with evolution, whether it's classical or this punctuated equilibrium. But it's very important to recognize that these transitional fossils between species have never been found. There's been certainly times where they've claimed it, but most every time it's been either a fraud or just found out to be not true. We'll look at some of that when we get to the biology section. We look at Neanderthals and cavemen and those kind of theories. So if we look at what's the problem with evolution, evolution really has a problem with the scientific method. There's uniformitarianism is really kind of a fancy word, but it just means that evolutionists believe that the present is the key to the past. So if you imagine, you're a scientist today and you measure some rate of change of something, the speed of light or radioactive decay or something like that, and you just say, well, that's going to be the way it was throughout all time. Millions of years ago, the same speed of light, the same radioactive decay rate, everything's the same, and you have total disregard for energy input. And that's a very much a bad way to look at things. I mean, in engineering school, usually you do have a first assumption of solving a problem, but in almost every case that your current initial guess is never the final answer. There's always some other process that affects the thing you're dealing with, and it's not a linear viewpoint on the solution. But of course, creationists, they take into account this energy input. There may be a certain observation that's current now, but if you look back in history, especially if there's volcanic activity And of course, we know for sure there was, a flood, Noah's flood, that was a huge energy that affected the entire world. And when you take those things into account, then things become a lot more clear. And I like to give a couple examples. Let me just share my screen one more time. And I have my glass of ice water here, if you can see that. So you can see that about 90% of it is melted, and there's about 10% of ice left. So if I were to come to your house one day and just say, hey, this glass of water was initially full of ice, and I want you to tell me, I'll give you $100 if you can tell me how long it took the ice to melt and give me the 90% ice, or 90% water and 10% ice. And you being a fancy scientist and well off with fancy instruments, you say, okay, I'll take that bet. And you use an atomic clock, and you invite your 10 PhD scientists over to figure this out, so you can win that $100. And you say, okay, we're going to time how long it takes the 10% of the ice to melt. And then once you know the time it takes 10% of the ice to melt, you can just say, okay, I know exactly how long it's going to take that 90% that melted in the past. Well, you put it on your kitchen counter, and you time the amount how long it takes, and you determine it took an hour to melt that 10%. So you say it took 9 hours to melt the 90% that was there and that you see in the water. Well, the problem is when you call me up and I say, well, that's a good try, and you spend a lot of effort in trying to determine that 90% melt, but you didn't know before I came over that I set my glass on my driveway in the middle of the summer, and it was 110 degrees out, and it melted that 90% in an hour itself. And so you're actually 9 times too slow in determining how long it took the ice to melt. So that's just a quick example of the very, very similar thing that evolutionists do. They have all these fancy equipment and fancy PhDs, all looking at a problem that's measuring our current rate of change of things, the speed of light, the radioactive decay, and measuring rock ages or organic structures in carbon-14, things like that. And they take no disregard, or they have no disregard for that rate of change may be different in the past, because they don't acknowledge that there may have been some other process that influenced it. So that's what we see there. Another example I like to give is have the spoon here. And I don't know if you've ever seen a magic trick where someone will bend a spoon and supposedly do it with their mind or something like that. But you can see it's a pretty, I can bang it on my hand. It looks like a normal spoon, and would be very difficult to break. But what you didn't know before class was, put it over here, you can see it better, is I bent it to a number of times until it hit basically it's right before its yield, the yield strength of the metal. So if I could just take my 2 little fingers and I just broke the spoon in half. And so again, you didn't know what I did before. You didn't know all the energy input that I put onto that spoon. And so you didn't know that it would take that little bit of energy to break it. So again, that's an example of because you don't know things, you're assuming things that are incorrect, and that's exactly what's happening in the evolutionary theories. All right, so let's just go back to our class here. And of course, evolution has a problem with basic physics. We looked at that a little bit last week. There's, in particular, the second law of thermodynamics. Over time, disorder increases, and evolution says that order increases over time. You can see that red line, that entropy is going down in evolution, but physics says entropy should increase. And creationism believes physics and believes that disorder and chaos increase over time. And of course, entropy or chaos degrades and destroys information. And I kind of came up with this little life equation here where you have matter plus energy. If there's no design, that gives you entropy and chaos and no life. But if matter and energy is designed, which we know it is by God, then you get information, which equals life. So that's kind of the life equation there. So there has to be a designer before life can come about. When I was a kid, I kind of grew up in a rural area, and we didn't have cable TV or anything like that, and relied on just an antenna. And I had suffered many a night of disappointment because my favorite TV show couldn't come on, and it was just a bunch of static. And just like in this little animation here, but you can see we probably all experienced, especially if you never had cable, that kind of thing. But no amount of energy, no matter how great, could ever produce an image. Even if you left this TV on for 15 billion years and let this static just do what it's going to do, evolutionary theory would say, well, sooner or later, these little pixels on the screen would eventually randomize in such a way that would produce at least some image of some way or somehow. But given enough time and energy, but that's just not the case. You'll never see any kind of image coming out of the static like that. And it also has a problem with basic biology. There's this concept of irreducible complexity, and that's just a system composed of several parts that are all contribute to the function of the system, but one part is removed, the system ceases to exist or ceases to function. Even Darwin made a comment about the human eye and how complex it was, and he just scratched his head on how that could have ever evolved. Because you see, I mean, normally if you think about like a little lizard that may be blind when it's created or evolved, well, the only way it can survive better is if a fully eye came about through one of its generations. But how is a fully functional eye going to come about? It would, due to evolutionary processes, it's going to be one little bit at a time. But if you have just a little bit of it at a time, it's still blind until the full eye is formed. So you could have the optic nerve, but you don't have the retina. Well, it's not going to see, so it's going to die out. If you have the pupil, but not the cornea, then it's going to die out because it still can't see. So there's no feedback that's going to allow it to survive better until the eye is fully formed. And so there's no way that eye could really come about all at the same time. I like to talk about the watch example, where I could even give evolutionists the benefit of saying, hey, I got this watch and I'm going to take it apart. So all the parts are there, and I'm going to take it apart and put it in a box. And so all that has to happen is these parts just have to come back together and for the watch to be fully functional. And that's given them a lot of benefit, because in nature, you don't have all the parts. There aren't pupils just lying around or corneas laying around. They have to have come about by some means. But in my watch example, all these parts are existing, and I put it in a box, and if I shook it, I put all kinds of energy I knew to it, and if I shook it for millions of years, billions of years, that watch would never come together as a fully functioning watch again. If anything, the process of shaking it up would probably destroy it, because it would be exhibiting friction and things like that across the different parts. But it definitely requires a designer and a working knowledge of the system, and you just don't see that with just random chance. And this is a really neat video. So that was a pretty neat little film there that the scientists came up with. But so it's like that with all areas of science, really. And we see in this table here this catastrophic viewpoint, the more of the creationist viewpoint. It shows 6,000 years versus the uniformitarian or evolutionist viewpoint of the universe being almost 14 billion, with the Earth's creation date about 4.6 billion, and man's creation date about 3 million. So the evolutionists think that all processes continue as they did in the beginning, and don't take into account the catastrophic events that have happened. So we see that God's character is definitely maligned. We talked about that some last week. Number two, Jesus' death could not pay for our sin. We talked about that a little bit. If death existed before Adam, then death is not the penalty for sin. So how could Christ's death pay for that sin? And if death is not tied to Adam's sin, then life is not tied to Christ's death and resurrection, and the Christian faith is all in vain. And this is really kind of a sad issue about evolution. Is this eugenics, the self-direction of human evolution? Most people haven't heard about this, but actually the United States was the first country to undertake forced sterilization programs. If you were born and you had some kind of maybe some kind of mental retardation or something like that, they didn't want those kind of folks to be to get married and have kids or anything like that, so they would sterilize them, forced sterilization. And they did this all the way up to 1981. Of course, by the end of World War II, Hitler was a very big proponent of eugenics. He thought that the German race, was the master race, that they were superior to everyone else, and certainly superior to the Jews. And 400,000 were sterilized, 70,000 were euthanized, and millions of Jews were exterminated. So you can imagine that's a pretty bad result of evolutionary thought. Everyone enjoyed this class. We'll finish it up next week. There's probably about 10 more slides to this section, but we'll continue that next week and also get into cosmology. So that's a pretty interesting field there, and some of the breakthroughs they've done. But hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Hope to see you again next week. And I saw where there's at least one person that somehow didn't get the email. I would just say, if you don't see the email on Tuesday, make sure you look in your junk folder or trash folder in your email, because I am sending this from Yahoo type emails, and maybe your email address may throw away the email. So just be careful and make sure you look at it, and because I should have everybody's email correct and be able to send those out every Tuesday. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you had a good week. So we'll see you next time.